The U.S. Central Bank raises interest rates again by a quarter point despite the recent banking crisis and hinted at further rate hikes, meaning restoring price stability still remains the Fed's top priority. Yet another wave of sandstorms from China is expected to blanket the Korean peninsula until Friday. People are advised to refrain from outdoor activities and gear up with face masks when going outside. French President Emmanuel Macron refuses to back down over the pension age rise. The defiant leader wants the pension bill plan implemented by end of the year, even if it means bearing unpopularity. We begin in the U.S. this morning. The central bank raises interest rates again by a quarter point despite the recent banking crisis and hints at further rate hikes, meaning restoring price stability still remains the Fed's top priority. Our Lee Dae-hyun starts us off.
The U.S. Federal Reserve takes another baby step. The central bank on Wednesday raised its short-term borrowing rate by 0.25 percentage points as they continue efforts to bring down inflation. This comes despite concerns that previous rate increases helped trigger the nation's banking crisis. The rate hike brings the Fed's policy rate to the 4.75% to 5% range, the highest since October 2007. The Fed pointed to modest growth in spending and production as one of the reasons for imposing another hike. It also added that an unemployment rate has remained low amid job gains in recent months, while inflation remains elevated. The Fed also rejected concerns about the financial system, saying that the U.S. banking system is sound and resilient.
We will continue to closely monitor conditions in the banking system and are prepared to use all of our tools, as needed, to keep it safe and sound. In addition, we are committed to learning the lessons from this episode and to work to prevent events like this from happening again.
As banks rely on a central source of capital, the rapid rise in interest rates tanked the value of bonds held by Silicon Valley Bank, causing the bank's failure. Because of this, there have been speculation from some experts that the central bank might not impose another rate hike following global concerns about bank stability. The Fed has been pushing on with its aggressive campaign to tame inflation, raising the rate by 75 basis points 4 times in a row last year. Although hikes had slowed down last December and February, analysts prior to the SVB crisis had suggested the need for another giant step as inflation once again crept up and a boost in employment figures. But once SVB collapsed, experts say this 25 basis points increase is a middle ground decision for the Fed. The central bank meanwhile left the door open for further rate increases, noting that additional policy firming may be appropriate to lower inflation to the Fed's 2% target. Policymakers expect rates to tick higher this year, with the benchmark rate peaking at 5.1% by the end of 2023. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
Yet another wave of sandstorms from China is expected to blanket the Korean peninsula until Friday. People are advised to refrain from outdoor activities and gear up with face masks when going outside. Our Lee Seung-ja has more.
A cloud of dust covers the Chinese capital city of Beijing. Drivers turned on their headlights even during the day, and people are wearing their face masks throughout the city. On Wednesday, the air quality in Beijing reached hazardous levels, with the main pollutant being fine dust. And it didn't help that China is also experiencing the worst yellow dust of the year, originating from the Gobi Desert. Starting Thursday, that yellow dust is headed to South Korea. With northwest winds carrying the yellow dust, Incheon and Gyeonggi-do province are under a yellow dust advisory. The Ministry of the Environment on Wednesday issued an advisory at attention, the lowest of 4 levels. High levels of yellow dust are expected to hit Seoul, North Chungcheong-do province, and Jeollabuk-do province by Thursday afternoon, with Jeollanam-do and Gangwon-do provinces expected to be hit with the yellow dust by evening. Prime Minister Han Duck-soo called on relevant ministries to make sure measures are put in place to protect people in the country. He also called on the people to check that windows are closed properly and refrain from any outdoor activities. Elderly citizens are especially asked to stay indoors. Experts say with factories in China in full operation after the lifting of its zero-COVID policy, high concentrations of heavy metal could be brought in along with the yellow dust. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Now, on to the north. Pyongyang launched more missiles on Wednesday, this time cruise missiles. They came just a day before the joint drills between Seoul and Washington come to an end. Our Kim Mo-kyun tells us more.
South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff says that North Korea begun firing several cruise missiles from its Hamhung area at around 10:15 a.m. on Wednesday. Authorities are analyzing further details, while sources say there were likely long-range strategic cruise missiles, also known as the North's version of Washington's Tomahawk. Wednesday's launch comes amid Seoul and Washington's combined Freedom Shield exercise, as well as the concurrent field training exercise called the Warrior Shield. The launches are seen as an act of protest by the North. Following the launch, Seoul's military said through a press release that it will successfully wrap up the Freedom Shield and continue to carry out the Warrior Shield in a high-intensity manner. It also added that the military has been on close watch of the regime and its movements, though they cannot reveal all the details. The latest launch also comes just 3 days after North Korea fired a short-range ballistic missile into the East Sea during what it claimed to be tactical nuclear counterattack drills. Pundits are now on the watch for further provocative actions from Pyongyang as the joint 11-day Freedom Shield exercise is set to end on Thursday. Kim Mo-kyun, Arirang News.
For the first time in 5 years, South Korea joins the UN Human Rights Council as a co-sponsor for its upcoming resolution on North Korea's human rights abuses. According to Yonhap News Agency, citing multiple diplomatic sources, Seoul is among the list of countries that took part in discussions to draw up the preliminary resolution led by the EU. Similar resolutions have been adopted for the past 20 years in a row. But South Korea did not co-sponsor them for 4 straight years since 2019 in consideration of inter-Korean peace efforts. Among the new concerns cited in this year's preliminary resolution are the regime's ban on foreign cultural contents and its inhumane treatment of foreign detainees. The finalized resolution will be submitted to a session slated for later this month. The U.S. Fed has lifted its key interest rate to the 4.75% to 5% range. And Wednesday's decision marks the 9th rate rise in a row. Why can't the Fed end interest rate hikes despite the recent banking turmoil? For more on this, let's turn to Professor Joshua William Mason from John Jay College. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So the Fed went ahead with a quarter-point rate hike despite the recent failures in the banking system. Now, walk us through the reasons behind the bold move.
Well, the basic notion here is that by raising the interest rate that the Fed sets for banks to lend to each other, that makes credit less available for the rest of the economy. And the hope is that over time that will reduce spending on goods in short supply and also reduce employment, compelling workers to accept lower wages, and those lower wages eventually should get passed through to prices. That's the theory. One problem here is that many of the price increases that have been driving recent inflation are not very linked to the kind of credit conditions that the Fed can influence. But another problem, as we're seeing now, is that monetary policy like this has to be carried out through the financial system, and it may put a lot of stress on the financial system before it actually has any impact on the real economy, and that puts the Fed in a very difficult position.
Right, I'm sure it was a challenging decision for the Fed to raise the interest rate this time. Now, then the question is, how effective will the rate hike be for taming the recent financial turmoil?
I don't think the rate hike in itself is going to help at all with the financial turmoil. I think other actions that have been taken, obviously the rescue of the depositors in these banks and the Fed's sort of promise to continue rescuing them, I think clearly there's been some failure to coordinate a message between the Fed and the White House, where you have Chairman Powell saying that deposits are safe and Secretary Yellen saying that there will be no guarantee for large deposits. There's some kind of inconsistency in the messaging there. But I think in principle, principle, those sorts of actions can, prevent further banking turmoil. The problem from the Fed's point of view is that offering additional support for the banks, additional emergency lending to the banks, as they've been doing, may sort of undermine their efforts to tighten financial conditions through these rate hikes.
Now, on to the inflation. Inflation in the U.S. in February continued its slow but gradual cooling trend. Now, how long will the Fed's fight against inflation continue, do you think? Is it nearing an end in any way?
I think so. I think that they're going to find that the stresses that rapid rate increases impose on the financial system are just intolerable. And even if they try to continue raising interest rates, they're going to be forced to do more lending through the discount window, through emergency facilities like the one that they created in the wake of the Silicon Valley bank failure, that it's basically going to offset whatever they're doing with these rate hikes. I think they've sort of reached the limit of what they can do without inflicting too much pain on the financial system. I'm not sure that, honestly, what they're doing now is having that much of an impact on inflation one way or another. A lot of the factors driving inflation, in my view, are really outside of the Fed's control.
Then there are some forecasts that say that the Fed's inflation fight will be over when it decides to actually freeze a rate. Are you on the same page?
I think that's true. Certainly, if you look at what participants in financial markets seem to expect, they expect an end to rate hikes quite soon, and probably a shift back towards cutting rates. So I think it's likely that we're seeing the end of this cycle of rate hikes. Hopefully, we're also seeing an end to inflation. But I think to some extent the Fed's hands are tied. Even if inflation remains high, I don't think they're going to be able to continue raising rates in the way that they have been.
Well, I mentioned earlier, inflation in February continued its slow but gradual cooling down. What's your forecast on the March in terms of U.S. economy?
Well, unfortunately, there are some factors that could pull measured inflation back up. There's reason to think used car prices, which were a big factor in inflation in the first surge of inflation a year and a half ago, used car prices could well start going up again. There's a real shortage. It looks like developing there. And because of the lags in the way we measure rental prices in the CPI, it's very likely that rents, which are a very large part of the price index, are going to keep rising for a while. So I would not be surprised to see measured inflation go back up in the next month or two.
Before we let you go, Professor Mason, so the Fed Chief Jerome Powell mentioned that the Fed will not, there will be no lowering interest rate. What do you think the reasons are behind the comment?
I think that honestly, he feels that they were too slow to respond to inflation the first time. Powell initially was very outspoken for a Fed chair about the importance of maintaining full employment, about the importance of strong wage growth, about the Fed's responsibility for the distribution of income and helping those at the bottom of the ladder who are really the ones who are affected by high unemployment. And I think perhaps in some sense he feels now he has more to prove as an inflation fighter because of that position he took earlier, and he needs to be even more focused sort of single-mindedly on bringing inflation down than he otherwise might have been.
Right. All right, Professor Mason, thank you so much for your insight this morning.
Thank you.
Over in France, French President Emmanuel Macron refuses to back down over the pension age rise. Now, the defiant leader wants the pension bill plan implemented by the end of the year, regardless of how unpopular he is. Our Kim Do-yeon with the report.
In Paris, some streets are in flames as protesters on Wednesday ramp up their show of discontent over pension reforms. This is a response to French President Emmanuel Macron saying that he's adamant about raising the country's retirement age from 62 to 64 by the year 2030, despite the public anger.
As I speak to you right now, do you think I enjoyed doing this reform? No. Do you think I could have done the same as many others before me and swept the dust under the rug? Yes, maybe. But the reality is today there's one thing I regret. It's that we weren't able to inform of the constraints and more specifically the need to undergo this reform.
While the protests were largely peaceful when President Macron first proposed the plan, but following his decision to push the bill through without a parliamentary vote last week and subsequently surviving 2 no-confidence votes, the situation in parts of the country has gone downhill. And Macron on Wednesday faced the cameras for the first time since then, where he said he understood the public's anger but condemned violent protests. But above all, he made it clear that the system has to be changed.
When I entered into my working life, there were 10 million retirees. Now there are 17 million. In the 2030s, there will be 20 million. Do you think that we can continue with the same laws?
The bill is now in the hands of the French Constitutional Council or the country's constitutional court. The judges will be looking into the law over the coming weeks, and it can only be passed with their approval. Macron says the bill needs to be enacted before the end of the year. In the meantime, French unions have announced more protests and call for people to join in. High-speed and regional trains, the Paris Metro, and other public transportation in major cities were expected to be disrupted. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Just a day after Chinese President Xi Jinping concluded his trip to Russia for what he called peace talks, a Russian drone strike hit a high school in Kyiv region, killing 4 and injuring 7 others. According to Ukraine's State Emergency Service, Wednesday's drone attack also partially destroyed 2 floors used as a residence for high school students. Russia also conducted drone strikes in other regions of Ukraine overnight, hitting an apartment complex in Zaporizhia, where several more people were killed. And the attacks came just a day after Russia accused Ukraine of drone attacks on Russian territory. For a look at the news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley joining us here in the studio. Good morning, Matthew.
Good morning, Tommy.
Let's start in Afghanistan and Pakistan. An earthquake there has killed over a dozen people. Tell us more.
Well, that's right. At least 19 people have been killed and over 200 have been injured after a 6.5 magnitude earthquake struck the northern regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan on Tuesday local time. Now, at least 10 of those who died were in Afghanistan, and the total death toll is expected to rise as rescue teams in both countries work to find survivors. Now, the quake triggered landslides and caused some buildings to collapse. Some tremors were even felt in India, as well as in the Afghan capital Kabul and Pakistani capital Islamabad. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the earthquake was recorded at 187 kilometers deep, and its center was 40 kilometers southeast of the Afghan town of Jurm. The quake came at a time when many families were outside their homes celebrating Nowruz, the Persian New Year. Moving on to Scotland now, where 35 people have been injured after a ship tipped over. Strong winds dislodged the ship from its holdings at Edinburgh's Imperial Dock on Wednesday morning local time. Among those injured, 23 were sent to hospital, with some in serious condition. 12 others were treated at the scene. Pictures show the 3,000-ton U.S. Navy research vessel, Petrel, leaning at a 45-degree angle in the dry dock. The U.S. consulate in Edinburgh has said it is offering support to U.S. citizens involved and that it's monitoring the situation. It also thanked local emergency services for their quick response. Meanwhile, a museum in the Austrian capital of Vienna is drawing awareness to climate change by hanging its paintings askew. The Leopold Museum has opened a new exhibit titled A Few Degrees More, where 15 paintings by the likes of Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele have been tilted by a few degrees. Now, the number of degrees tilted reflects the number of temperature degree changes expected at locations depicted in each of the paintings. The exhibit comes just a few months after the same museum was targeted by members of the climate activist group Last Generation. Activists threw black, oily liquid on a Klimt painting protected by glass, with one even gluing themselves to this glass. And finally, the world's oldest near-complete Bible has gone on display in a museum in Israel. Viewable in the Museum of the Jewish People, the leather-bound handwritten manuscript is believed to have been made around the year 900. It contains almost all of the Hebrew Bible and is called the Codex Sassoon, after its previous owner, David Solomon Sassoon. The display of the Bible comes before it's set to be auctioned by Sotheby's in New York in May. There, it's expected to go under the hammer for an estimated $30 to $50 million US. Now, if it sells close to its estimated value, it could become the most valuable historical document ever sold.
Good morning. Have an umbrella handy. The much anticipated rain that spread nationwide overnight is still dropping showers in most parts of Korea. Well, rain has already stopped in the capital region and will let up gradually elsewhere this afternoon. The south coast is seeing heavier rainfall this hour. Coastlines along Gyeongsang-do provinces could see up to 40 millimeters of rainfall today. But thanks to the showers, air quality is normal for now. But after the rain goes away, yellow dust will blow in, boosting air quality to very bad levels again. The capital and Chungcheongnam-do province will see severe levels from this afternoon. Temperature-wise, Seoul saw the record-breaking March warmth yesterday at 25.1 degrees Celsius. The temperature stays on the warmer side today at 22 degrees in the capital, but dropping to the upper teens in certain parts of the country. Now, cold northwesterly winds will bring down the temperatures to near norms. Then typical spring weather is in the forecast with wide gaps in readings. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That wraps up today's New Day at Arirang. We'll be back tomorrow for Friday's edition at the same time. Thanks for watching.